I'm going to talk today about some of our more recent MRI research having to do with trying to understand the neural basis of volitional mental operations that people would typically have thought of as taking place in working memory. And I kind of came into this research through the back door. I started out as Patrick's graduate student 20-something years ago. And I was doing pretty much pure vision, and I was always very interested in the question of consciousness and how there could be what the neural basis of consciousness was. And it became pretty clear that this was fairly deeply intertwined with the question of endogenous attention or volitional attention, and that what we call consciousness is really a kind of highly precompiled or pre-processed type of representation that these volitional mental operations, including volitional attention, can operate on and operate over. So these three ideas become very deeply or intricately interlinked, which is the idea of consciousness, which is that which we can experience or report, and the volition and attention. And in particular, attention seems to be involved in a lot of these, maybe even most of these volitional mental operations. So volitional attention is not simply, shifting around a spotlight volitionally. It's also involved in volitional mental operations like mental rotation and so forth. Okay, so before I begin talking about the MRI stuff, I want to kind of spend, about 10 minutes talking about some of the big ideas, why this is interesting and how it ultimately relates to attention. So let me talk about the idea of mental operations, because I think that in our field, at least in the MRI end of things, people have a kind of large focus on the nouns of the mind and not very much the verbs of the mind. So for example, people talk a lot about things like objects, spaces, houses, places, and so forth, but there's much less focus on the kinds of mental operations or the verbs of the mind that can operate over those kinds of operands, which is something more like this, things like mental rotation, taking things apart or putting them together in your mind, manipulating them in different ways, and so forth. And so really the question here is, what is the neural basis of these, particularly these volitional mental operations that take place in our mental workspace, which can be defined as a sort of internal virtual reality that allows us to play things out before we actually do them in the world. You could also think of it as the imagination. The idea is that there are these mental operations that take place over operands in an internal mental workspace, which is a kind of internal virtual reality. Okay, so here you're looking at some beautiful renditions of some of your ancestors. So Australopithecus afarensis on the lower left is probably about 3.5 million years old. Africanus about 3 million years ago. On the lower right, Boise is actually a species of Australopithecus that went off in a different direction, sort of a vegetarian direction, and so that is not our ancestor. Some people put it into a different genus, not Australopithecus, but Paranthropus. Then you see Homo habilis there in the upper left, and here we're talking about 2.5, 2.2 million years ago. These are the first ones to make tools. And then you have Homo erectus, let's say about 2 million, 1.8 million years ago, and they may have survived as long as until some tens of thousands of years ago. It's not clear. And then you see Heidelbergensis, Homo heidelbergensis in the upper right, which is the common ancestor of us and Neanderthals. And we're talking here about 600,000-700,000 years ago. Now, take a look at their skulls, and you'll see that their skulls are not only getting bigger, but also you're going to see more and more forehead. Now, Heidelbergensis gave rise to later species, as I mentioned, Neanderthals, or it's like Chuck Norris a bit, and then our species. Now, let's go back to habilis. So this is about 2.5 million years ago. They find the first tools, and even though our ancestors were bipedal for at least 1, maybe even 2 million years before this, nobody was making any tools. And then quite suddenly, in what's now Olduvai Gorge, in East Africa, they find these kinds of rocks that seem to have been broken intentionally, but they're pretty primitive. It's almost as if they're just bashing rocks together and finding anything that's sharp. There's a big revolution in the tool set. And in Homo erectus, you find the so-called Acheulean hand axe. Now, what's why do we care about these tools at all? Well, neural circuits don't leave fossils, and behavior usually doesn't leave fossils. Thoughts certainly don't leave fossils. So how can we possibly know what the brain circuits were that changed, that led to our kinds of brains, which are so different from the brains of chimps? Okay, so this Acheulean hand axe has this very particular teardrop shape, and what's really notable about it is that it hardly changes for more than 1 million years. There's just really almost no innovation. This creature, our ancestor Homo erectus, was very uncreative, even though it made these tools, presumably volitionally. It had to have some kind of intention in its head. That's the range of Homo erectus, presumably, and it seems to me that the fact that the hand axes you find in India or in Africa are more or less the same shape over more than 1 million years suggested something like a template in their heads. Something maybe like a bowerbird has a template in its head, and that's a nest of a bowerbird. Okay, now here we're talking about the Neanderthals. Neanderthals had a much more developed tool set, and in fact, their brains were bigger than ours. So their brains were on the order of 1450 cubic centimeters, whereas ours are around 1300 or 1350. But again, their so-called Mousterian tool set hardly changed for more than 150,000 years, even though it was very, very developed. So again, they were very non-innovative, non-creative, very, very different from us. And our species then kind of shows up in Europe around 42,000 years ago, and they pretty much invade Europe from outside of Europe, and they may have come up the Danube. And you'll see as they go up the Danube, they end up in a place where they can't go any further up the Danube, and that's southern Germany. And all around this area are these caves where they're finding all these quite incredible artifacts from 40,000 years ago. Now, here are some beautiful tools and pieces of artwork that our species made. This is from Europe. The initial the stone tool sets were not that different from the Mousterian of the Neanderthals, but there was a kind of change in that there was the first art. And that's really unlike anything that came before it. So there's something going on in our brains that allowed us to start creating art. And I'm particularly interested in this ivory carving that you see on the right. It's called the Löwenmensch, or Lion Man, and it has the head of a lion and the body of a man. So whoever carved this 30 to 40,000 years ago in southern Germany had to have in their mind a lion's head and a human body, put them together in their mind, and then go about building this. This had to be an intentional act. And there's just nothing like this in the artifact or fossil record before our kinds of brains emerge onto the scene. And there are these kinds of strange, inexplicable things that the archaeologists find that are hard to explain. Is this symbolic? Is this some sort of representation of the moon? Again, our kinds of brains seem to be creating things that are just unlike anything the Neanderthals or Homo erectus before them created. So there had to be changes, I think, in our neural circuitry that afforded this. And then there's these kinds of statues, these representational statues or icons. So in the lower left there, you'll see a lot of these upper Paleolithic or Stone Age figurines, often of women with exaggerated features. And there's some claims that there might be something art-like, even close to 300,000 years ago, but it's just so incredibly primitive that it's kind of dubious that was created intentionally. And then here's some other examples. So pretty much at the same time as you see the emergence of art, you see the emergence of musical instruments. So whatever it is that's happening in our brains leads to this kind of explosion of creativity in our species. Now, there are precursors to this in Africa. Now, this is both Europe. In both cases, there had to be a combination in our minds, I think, beforehand, before creating this in the world. So there had to be, I think, volitional operations taking place in working memory, combining the heads of something with the bodies of something else. So how do we do this? What kind of mental operation could create these kinds of creations in our minds before we go out into the world and build them? And, I think that these kinds of mental operations underlie a lot of what we do in terms of planning, such as, for example, planning, take the case on the right of whom to invite for dinner tonight. You could say, well, I want to invite 6 people. Let it be, say 3 men, 3 women. Sheila and Bob went out with each other. Okay, take Bob out. Put in somebody else, and we can play this out. We can deliberate in our internal virtual reality in a volitional way for minutes, days, even sometimes years. We'll be dwelling on something, planning something. All right, so before I get to the MRI stuff, let me just kind of finish up by pointing out what's changing in our ancestors. So if you look at Homo erectus there in front, they didn't have that much of a vertical forehead. And then you have Heidelbergensis there in the middle, and then you have a Neanderthal with their rather huge brains in the back. And that's quite different from our foreheads. So our foreheads, in the mirror there, you see a Neanderthal, and then on the right there, you see our species, also known as Cro-Magnon. And you can see that what really sets us apart is this kind of giant vertical forehead. So something's going on in this part of our brain in particular, because the skull conforms to the brain as it develops, not the other way around. So not only are our brains getting bigger over millions of years, from about the size of a chimp's brain, which would say about 350 cc, up to the present 1350 cc. So roughly the brain's increasing 3 times in volume. In addition, it's our foreheads that are getting especially big. So if you were to blow up a chimpanzee brain up to the same volume as our brain, so you increase the volume 3 times, you would see basically that it is this area that is disproportionately big relative to a normalized chimp brain. So it really seems to be some kind of change in these executive circuits, including working memory circuits, that really has set our species apart. So it seems like this is a good place to look for whatever the neural basis is of that which made us so different from even a Neanderthal, but certainly different than a chimp. All right. So, we're not unique in having a prefrontal cortex. Even a cat has prefrontal cortex. It's all the cortical areas that link through the anterior nucleus of the thalamus. But in us, it's just disproportionately enormous. So, one argument is that it is changes in these executive circuits and working memory circuits that really got us going on the path that led to human behavior and human cognition. And once this comes to exist, it can then be a focus of sexual selection. So so in birds and mammals, it's typically the males that compete and the females that select among them. And if working memory capacity or intelligence or creativity became attractive, then that could have led to something like a peacock's tail phenomenon. Nobody knows, again, because fossils and artifacts are all we have, and we don't know exactly what the neural circuits were. We can only kind of guess. All right, so I'm going to now talk about the MRI stuff. Does anybody have any questions about those motivating ideas? Okay, so I'm going to move on to the MRI stuff. I'm going to talk about the 3 papers that I sent you. They're all fairly recent. So I'm going to begin by talking about, Baddeley's standard model of working memory. And so he argued that there's a central executive that is anatomically localized in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and then there are these sort of slave modules. So it's a sort of a master-slave relationship where the slave modules are in visual cortex and in auditory cortex and probably other comparable areas. And so in 2003, he kind of laid it out as really a set of anatomically distinct regions of the brain that function as anatomical modules that are also functional modules. And so CE here is his central executive that that calls down to these slave modules. VC would be the visual spatial sketchpad as needed. And so, one question we want to ask is this an appropriate model of working memory? And we're going to come to the conclusion that no, it's not, but I'll walk us through it. Okay, so the typical kinds of experiments that look at working memory historically involve short-term maintenance and not manipulation of information. So, for example, people would do 1 back tasks, 2 back tasks, and so forth. And sure enough, they would find activation in these so-called working memory areas, like DLPFC, posterior parietal. But people weren't really focusing on manipulation, with a couple of exceptions. Right. And so, again, the field was very much focused on the nouns of the mind, like objects and maintaining objects, and very much kind of ignoring the verbs of the mind, which would be these mental operations over these kinds of operands. Now, an exception would be the mental operation of mental rotation, studied in the 70s by Roger Shepard, I think then at Stanford. And he published pretty amazing psychophysics that showed a very linear relationship between the degree or the angle over which something had to be rotated and the time it took to correctly answer that 2 objects were rotated versions of each other. And this suggested that whatever's going on is something like an analog rotation in this internal virtual reality, which is very nice. And I always tell my students that they should do psychophysics first and foremost, because in 10,000 years, this kind of stuff will still be, true, even if you don't know where in the brain it's happening or how it's happening. That it's happening seems to be established. Okay. Now, building on Roger Shepard's work, you have people like Steve Kosslyn, who went into the MRI world and elsewhere, PET, and tried to figure out the neural circuits involved in this mental operation of mental rotation. And they found, for example, that that motor cortex seems to be engaged when you are carrying out a mental operation of mental rotation, which is interesting. So we're going to kind of do some replications of this as well in the 3rd experiment. All right, so now I want to talk about the 3 experiments, one after the other. The first one is trying to nail down what this mental workspace network is for at least one particular task. And so building on the puzzle of this kind of artifact, which had to involve, putting together a representation of a lion's head with a human body before going out and building this in the world, we came up with a sort of toy world version of putting things together and taking them apart. And so we started out with basically 4 possible things a person could do. A person could either maintain a representation, or they could carry out an operation on a representation. So here, can you see my arrow cursor? Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so here is a whole object, and you can either remember it over several TRs, or you can be given the task of taking it apart into its component parts. And so there are certain quadrants, I think it was 1, 2, 3, 4, and you had to decompose them into the corresponding subshapes. Similarly, you could be given parts, and you could either remember them or maintain them over several seconds, or you could have a mental operation of constructing them in a particular order into that. And so obviously this would be quite intensive, to build this up in your working memory. And this would also be intensive, but remembering it or maintaining it should be something somewhat easier. All right, so the first step we did was simply to look for the areas that we wanted to carry out pattern classification within. So we started off with a general linear model, simply contrasting cases where there was a bold signal level difference between the 2 cases of maintaining and mental operation. We go with the GLM, we get our candidate areas, and then within these candidate areas, we will classify or use multivariate pattern analysis within those candidate areas to see whether we can classify shapes and operations. All right, so carrying out the GLM leads to these sort of candidate areas, which I think are going to be familiar to most of you. I'll just run through them. So occipital or visual cortex, cerebellum, posterior parietal cortex, precuneus, lateral occipital complex, thalamus, whatever that is, medial temporal lobe, frontal eye fields, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, supplementary eye fields. I think it's frontal operculum, and then MFC is whatever it is, medial frontal, I think. Okay, so now this is, if you look at these areas now, so if you do MVPA, or multivariate pattern analysis within these candidate areas that were defined using GLM, and simply look for percent correct classification, you can correctly classify what somebody is manipulating and or what they're remembering very well. So this is usually where most MVPA studies stop. They simply say we get a lot of good classification in these 6 brain areas. MVPA actually has a lot more information in it. You know, there's also a pattern of mistakes that people make or misclassifications. I'm sorry, not that people make, that the classifier makes. And there's additional information that can be extracted by looking at patterns of mistakes as well. Sort of like, you know, you can take a lemon and squish it one way and get a lot of information out, but if you squish it a different way, you can squeeze additional information out. So we wanted to push the methods a bit to try to get more information out of MVPA. So what we did is we basically had a situation where we could create a confusion matrix. And so the confusion matrix will involve 4 kinds of things, 2 kinds of operations, where we're either constructing the parts together into a whole, or we're taking the parts apart taking the whole apart into its parts. So these are mental operations. And then there's the 2 cases of maintaining or simply remembering what you were shown. So the idea would be that for mental operations, that these should be more confusable, and their classifier should make confusions between these 2 cases more often than the classifier would make a mistake between this case and this case, because operations should be more confusable with each other, and mental representation should be more confusable with each other. So based on that assumption, we created confusion matrices. So we would expect highest classification when people are in fact constructing a part, and the classifier says they're constructing a part, parts into a whole. And we should expect we should expect a high classification when they are deconstructing a figure, and when the classifier thinks they're deconstructing a figure. But if there's going to be confusion, it's going to be between these cases, because this is an operation and this is an operation. So there should be more confusion between cases where there are operations, and there should be more confusions among cases of maintenance. So we can either maintain the parts or maintain the figure. And so we should expect this pattern of correct classifications, but also this pattern of incorrect classifications. And there should be much less confusion between cases of when people are, the classifier should find it much less often to be the case that when they're carrying out an operation that the classifier thinks that they're maintaining a representation, or vice versa. So now what we can do is classification. Yeah?
I have a question. Would you not make any prediction that working on the parts might be more likely confused with manipulating the part, maintaining the parts, and the figure with the figure? Because here you have evenly divided.
I'm going to get to that, because we can create different confusion matrices for different hypotheses, and we did do that. So I'll get to that in about 5 minutes. All right, so what we can do now is take this confusion matrix and then look for correlations between this confusion matrix and the empirically derived patterns of classification and misclassification and look where we can get where we get our best correlations. So what's shown on the right there are actual empirically found patterns of correct and incorrect classification in the different brain areas under consideration. And we can then correlate our hypothetical confusion matrix with these. So now to get to David's question, we can create different confusion matrices. So we might think, for example, at the time of input, let's say you have a case where that would be, let's say you're given either this or you're given this. Let's consider this case where you're given this. At the beginning, at the level of the input, you would think there would be confusability between the case where you start out with this and then have to construct it, or the case where you start out with this and you have to remember it. So we can create this kind of confusion matrix, which is going to be correlated with the input. Then we can create this kind of correlation matrix that or confusion matrix that I already talked about, that is driven by similarities or confusabilities among operations. So now there's more confusion among constructing the parts into a whole or deconstructing the figure into its parts. And similarly, there's going to be the cases of confusion regarding the output, because you can get to this point at the output either by remembering this or by constructing these parts into this. So we can now look for patterns of correlation over time and try to capture the mental operation kind of in the act. And because this is quite difficult to actually do, it plays out over many seconds. So if you do this, you can actually look for brain areas that have sort of a peak of the correlation between the hypothetical confusion matrix and the actual confusion matrix in different brain areas. So we're interested in areas that would show sort of a peak in the input confusability, followed by a peak in operation confusion, followed by a peak in output confusion. And there are 4 areas that sort of match that pattern. And this is corresponding to TR. So for those of you who don't know, a TR stands for temporal resolution. In this case, it's 2 seconds following stimulus onput. And so in occipital cortex and posterior parietal, in DLPF, PFC, and in precuneus, you have this sort of pattern of peaks corresponding to the input, followed by the operation, followed by the output. So one could argue that this is sort of catching the mental operation in the act over many seconds. Okay, so what we can do now is look at this network and look for patterns of, all you're doing really is not looking at connectivity so much as patterns of correlation in the bold signal between 2 areas. And what we noticed is that when people are carrying out manipulations here, you get one sort of pattern of the global network of functional connectivities or correlations between brain areas. Whereas when you're in a maintained state, you get a different pattern. So in the maintained state, you have sort of a hub in the medial temporal lobe. And when you are in the manipulate state, you have a sort of hub of activity in the precuneus posterior parietal cortex, maybe linking with DLPFC. So there seems to be different patterns of network functional connectivity depending on whether you're carrying out a mental operation or simply maintaining a representation. Right, so is the precuneus a hub for mental operations? I don't know, but it's suggestive. Is the medial temporal lobe a hub for maintenance? Again, I don't know, but it's again suggestive. All right, so that was the first experiment, and so the summary of that is that there's a brain-wide network for manipulating mental images. We can track the processing of these mental operations from input to mental operation to output in this mental workspace as it unfolds. Because the operation was so difficult, we can kind of catch it on the fly over many seconds. And this connectivity profile really seems to depend on what the mental operation is and whether you're carrying out a mental operation or simply maintaining. a representation. So I'll pause there. Are there any questions about experiment 1? All right, then I'll move on to experiment 2.
Peter, this is Charlie.
Hi, Charlie.
Question about that citation to Schlegel. I'd like to look that one up.
At the end of this talk, all the citations are listed. So Natalie sent you guys the PowerPoint, and at the end, the last slide of the PowerPoint contains the citation.
Ah, okay, thank you.
Oh, sure. Okay, so now we'll talk about experiment 2. It's a paper that came out last year. So now we're looking at a mental operation. And this is the case of mental rotation. Actually, we're going to focus on a particular form of mental rotation. We're going to take these sort of shapes that were made by modifying either a grid network or a polar grid or a quadratic grid. And we have shapes that kind of are S or T shaped and then sort of, I don't know, tadpole shaped. So if you're looking for your confusion matrix based on shape, you would probably think that these two are more confusable. And so you might have a pattern of confusion like this, where this is a high classification. But if you misclassify, you're more likely to misclassify this shape with this shape than this shape with, say, that shape. And similarly, you confuse the two round cases more so than you would any round case with a sort of angular shape. And similarly for the operations, now you can either rotate a shape to the right, or you could rotate it to the left, or you can flip it horizontally, or you could flip it vertically. So we've got different kinds of basically mental rotations. And again, patterns of confusion should be such that rotating in the frontoparallel plane should be most confusable between this case and this case, or this case and this case, and much less so between this case and, say, this case. And similarly, you should probably confuse flips, say, this case with this case more often than you would this case with that case. So now we can do the same trick and use these confusion matrices in an attempt to squeeze more information out of multivariate pattern analysis, so that we're not only looking at patterns of correct classification or hits, we're also looking at different kinds of mistakes. So we're going to squeeze more juice out of our lemon by doing a correlation between these hypothetical confusion matrices and the actual patterns of classification and misclassification that we find in these brain areas. So this is actually what a subject did. They were given some kind of code. Everybody got a different code where you had A, B, C, D representing the shapes, and they had to learn their particular code. And 1, 2, 3, 4 correspond to some operation, and they had to learn their particular mapping. Everybody had a different mapping. And then after getting with the arrow, they're told to do this. So you can imagine it might mean like take the T shape and rotate it 90 degrees to the left. And then there's this blank period. We're going to do our classification in this period where there's nothing on the screen except the fixation spot. And then the test stimulus comes on, and they would then say which of these 1, 2, 3, or 4 was the correct response. In this case, it would be this, because they rotated the T shape to the left. And if they got it right, they got a monetary reward. And they were highly motivated, fully paying attention. But to make sure that they were fixating, we also gave them a very simple fixation task. All right, so this is where MVPA usually stops. Again, this is showing the pattern of correct classifications within the different regions of interest for the shape. So, can we classify whether it's, a T shape or one of the two T shapes or one of the two round shapes? And we have extremely high ability to classify shape. And then we can also classify extremely well, and these are, this is the number of zeros on the p-value. So we can classify with extreme precision what mental operation they're doing, but we want to go beyond this sort of traditional MVPA approach and exploit the fact that there are interesting patterns of errors. So what we'll do is, and then we wanted to go even beyond that, and we wanted to say, okay, can we create a classifier in one brain region and classify the mental operation or the shape in a different brain region? And so that requires some further sort of data analysis tricks. Now that gives us a problem, right? Because in an area like occipital, the representation of shape might be based upon representations that are something like this, whereas in DLPFC, it might be very abstract, like T-shaped or S-shaped or tadpole-shaped. So how can you possibly create a classifier for shape here and then use that classifier to decode what shape is represented here? And so to get at that, we sort of tried to figure out how you might attack this. So you might take an area like this would be, say, precuneus, and this would be posterior parietal. How could you possibly even begin to do this? Well, you would need to train your classifier, say, in precuneus, but you want to test your classifier in posterior parietal. So what you can do is look at the number of voxels you have in precuneus and the number of voxels you have in posterior parietal, and you'll see that they have a different number of voxels. So any classifier you created in precuneus would have a different dimensionality dictated by this number of voxels than the decoding that would happen in this different brain area. So the first step has to be getting everybody into a common dimensionality. So one thing you can do is simply take the bold signal from the bold signal over time in, say, an area like that's actually posterior parietal, and get, say, the top 50 principal components. And you could do the same for another area, say precuneus, and now you've got two sets of 50 principal components over time for your bold signal in these two brain areas, and you can kind of align them by minimizing the trace, making them most similar to each other. So now things are going to be in a similar space, and you've got your principal components in posterior parietal, you've got your principal components in precuneus. Now what you can do is do your MVPA in that higher dimensional normalized space or PCA space. And what we find is it actually works. I was actually surprised it worked, but it works actually surprisingly well. And we can decode the shape that somebody is representing by creating a classifier in, say, posterior parietal, and we can then decode that shape in a different brain area in, say, precuneus. That was not really so true for the mental operation. We couldn't decode if they're rotating to the left in say, precuneus by creating a decoder in the posterior parietal lobe. And so if you look at region of interest cross-classification done using this method, we're able to cross-classify across these 6 main regions of interest that we defined earlier. We can define representation really well. So the red here represents the ability to cross-classify or decode representations using a decoder made in one area and looking at patterns of bold signal in another area. That wasn't very true for manipulation again. And thickness basically corresponds to significance. All right, so now we can try to push the method even further. So what we just did is we did pattern analysis in a higher dimensional space, which was not the space of voxel activations with bold signal, but a space of principal components. Now what we can do is try to use MVPA over patterns of Granger causation. And if you don't know what Granger causation is, it's basically the idea that there's a certain amount of information you can get about what's going to happen in an area given that area's own past. But in some cases, you can get even more information if you know the past of some different area. So for example, if I wanted to know the weather in New York, or say in New Hampshire right now, I would actually gain, I could know a lot by knowing what the weather was in New Hampshire, say 12 hours ago. And I might even get extra information if I knew what the weather in Ohio was 12 hours ago, because the weather tends to move west to east. But it's probably not going to be as much the case the other way. So if I want to know the weather in Ohio now, it's useful to know what the weather was in Ohio 12 hours ago, but it's much less useful to know what the weather in New Hampshire was 12 hours ago, because the weather tends to flow west to east and not east to west. So Granger causation picks up on this extra oomph in that you get by knowing the past of some other area, and that oomph corresponds to the magnitude of the Granger causal value. All right, so what you can do is you can now take your principal components, and you can now do a Granger causality classification from each component to every other component. So this might be time 1, so TR1, and this would be 1 unit later, which in this case would be 2 seconds later, and then we could say we can create a bunch of we can get a Granger causal value for this principal component to this principal component 1 TR later in a different brain area, and so forth and so forth. And what we end up with is a graph of Granger causal values from one brain area to the next. Now, of course, this is not ideal because we're operating at the level of 2 seconds as opposed to the level of milliseconds, which is what the brain actually operates at. So, it's got limitations. So you now have a higher dimensional space of not just principal components. You've got this even higher dimensional, this higher representational space of causation across brain areas on a 2 second sort of coarse level of time. Now we can apply MBPA to this higher level of representation. Now, if you do that, you can now classify. You can classify representations across brain areas over time, and so there's a sort of information flow, which, if you organize it kind of in a graph theory way, basically the head of the hierarchy is occipital, and it seems to flow kind of forward, whereas DLPFC would be at the end of that hierarchy. But for classifying across brain areas using this higher representational space of Granger causal maps over time, over 1 TR, for operations, it looks much more sparse. And you can't cross-classify very much using Granger causal values, but you can to some degree, and the information flow seems to flow as you might expect from frontal areas, DLPFC to lateral occipital complex, or frontal eye fields down to occipital. And so I think we've been able to push MVPA out of the bold signal domain into these higher dimensional spaces with some benefit. So let me summarize experiment 2. It seems that information about what is represented, namely the shape, and what the mental operation is, namely rotating this way or that, is represented in a sort of very distributed way, especially for shape, and less so for mental operation, but that could be that mental operations are just happening on such a fast time scale that we can't pick it up with our very coarse, bold signal. But even with this sort of terrible temporal resolution, we're able to pick up on a kind of, I think, lovely hierarchical pattern of information flow. All right, so that was experiment 2. Any questions about experiment 2? Okay, so I'll go on to the last experiment. So in this experiment, we wanted to look at motoric representations, and we actually wanted to compare when people physically rotated their hands and when they did mental rotations in their head, and whether we can classify a mental rotation in your head based upon a classifier created over physical hand rotations and vice versa. So, when somebody manipulates something with their hands, or whether they do that in the internal virtual reality of their mental workspace or working memory, is there a kind of shared operation? So we're going to try to find that out. So again, here you have the old work of Shepard. What we did now is we looked in the same 6 brain areas that we looked in the previous 2 papers, because we believe these are key for this sort of task positive network or the working memory network or the mental workspace network involved in volitional mental operations. So we've got our key 6 ROIs that we defined in the past, but in addition, we're going to add in regions of interest corresponding to motor processing. And we're going to add in 6 of those for a total of 12. Oh, and then we threw in the cerebellum. All right, so those are our regions of interest. And so now, again, you've got different shapes that people can either rotate this way, this way, this way, or this way. And again, we're going to use our trick of looking for patterns of correct classification, which would be these, and then patterns of misclassification, which would be these, and then these. And we'd expect this to be more confusable with this than this would be with, say, that, because they share a common axis of rotation. Sorry. All right, so again, this is where MVPA typically stops, and we get very good classification throughout the motor cortex. You know, we can decode what mental operation they're doing very well in motor areas and in our 6 putative mental workspace regions of interest. But this is the key thing here. We created a classifier when they were in fact rotating their hands. In fact, they were holding little 3D printed sort of Shepherd Metzler objects when they did this. So we created a classifier when they rotate their hands, and we decode on their mental rotation from different trials, and vice versa. And we can actually cross-classify in premotor and in, well, to some extent in supplementary motor, and in posterior parietal and precuneus, and to some degree DLPFC. So in these working memory areas or mental workspace areas, we can decode a mental operation that's done in your internal virtual reality by creating a decoder that's done using motoric operations in the world. And that's also true for some of these premotor areas. Now, I think that's pretty interesting, suggesting that there's some sort of shared representation of mental operations across both manipulating objects in the world and manipulating objects in your imagination. And just as an aside, we're doing 250. Okay, I'll try to wind it up. You know, it makes me think that it might be important to make sure kids are out there using their bodies to create these mental operators so they'll have a good imagination later in life. Okay. Okay, so here you can, again, look at these cross-classifications across regions of interest. And here the color coding simply means the kind of network. So the sandy color here corresponds to the motor network. The blue corresponds to the traditional mental workspace network, and then the dark blue corresponds to the things that are connecting the mental workspace to the motor network. And what's interesting, I think, is that it's almost like the mental workspace can call the motor network as needed, almost like the executive, say, a contractor who's building a house, when needed, can call in the plumber, you know, to do a job, call in a subcontractor, and, you know, or call in the electrician as needed. It's almost like this executive mental workspace network that underlies working memory and probably other volitional mental operations that are generally that generally involve effortful volitional attentional manipulation of operands in working memory. This can call the motor network when needed, but when not needed, the motor network remains offline. All right, so let me summarize experiment 3. Information about mental rotations can be found throughout the motor network and throughout the mental workspace. And the motor network seems to be integrated into the mental workspace as needed. When you're not doing these mental rotations, the motor network probably isn't involved in these executive mental workspace areas. And then because we can cross-classify different types of physical, motoric, and mental operations, it suggested that there is a kind of shared representation at the level of operations. That's pretty interesting. And let me just conclude then. So the old view, sort of the Baddeley view of working memory is, I don't think it's just completely wrong. I think it's probably just incomplete and it's too simplistic. So I'll just cross it out. It's not that the anatomy is entirely modular and that the function is modular within that anatomy. That's too simplistic. Rather, it's something more like this, much more complicated. The information processing seems to be much more distributed, particularly for operands, or in this case, shape, and maybe less so for the mental operations, as if the mental operations seem to be more encapsulated within their particular brain area. And these are the people who did the great work, and these are the papers that you can go look at if you're interested. All right, I'll stop there and take questions, if any.
I have a question, Peter. It's Charlie.
Hi, Charlie.
Nice talk. I have a question that I was thinking about as you were talking, but then you made that final statement. I think 3 slides back.
Okay.
Go back. You said something about shape.
And
not quite sure. Yeah. What were you? Yeah. Go forward. Right
here?
There. Yeah.
Yeah. So the idea
shared shape format.
Well, so the reason I said that is that I can create a decoder, in this brain area for shape, and I can decode the shape in this other brain area after going to a higher level of representation of principal components at the same time, or TR, or I can go to a higher level of representation to these Granger causal value graphs, and those would be patterns of causation. Causation in the sense that I can predict that bold signal here seems to be playing some role or soaking up some variance in what the bold signal pattern or time course will be in this other brain area 1 TR or 2 seconds later. And so I can go to either of these abstract spaces, either principal component space or Granger causal graph space, and I can decode shape from this area, creating a decoder here, and then doing the decoding here. And all these lines indicate sort of, this is the Granger causal case. The fact that we get such a rich degree of connectivity, as shown here, all these red connections, suggests that there's something like a shared representation of shape across these brain areas.
Actual physical visual shape.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what that is, but whatever it is, it allows us to decode. There's some sort of shared language for shape. But there's a lot of inference going on here, and I wouldn't dare say it's visual shape because it would seem odd that creating a decoder in occipital would help me decode shape in posterior parietal. But the fact that we can do this suggests that there's some sort of shared representation of shape. The fact that we have much more trouble doing this with operations here, you can only see, and it didn't survive FDR correction, but between DLPFC and posterior parietal, we can decode across the 2 RRIs which manipulation or mental operation they're doing. So, yeah.
So if you had your, what would be the most burning, if you could put a bunch of electrodes in the brain of a monkey and have them do a working memory task, what would be the most burning question that you'd want to get an answer to?
Gosh, there's so many.
The most.
Well, okay. I mean, there's just so many. I mean, one thing, one set of claims is that there's actually an analog rotation that involves V1. If you had a bunch of V1 electrodes lined up, would you actually see a sequence of activations as the mental rotation sweeps across them? That would be interesting.
Right.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. Does anybody else have ideas? I mean, I think, it's tricky because, our field is very much dominated by this idea of representations or the tuning properties of neurons. In a way, the idea of a receptive field has helped us a lot, but it's also hindered us. That we think that we can understand a neuron by what it's tuned to, but something like a mental operation is, I think, not likely to be done by a single neuron, but something more like at the level of interacting circuits. And so how do you go about measuring a mental operation at the level of a single neuron? I think it's very tricky.
I'm talking about hundreds of electrodes that span a whole hemisphere. So let's say you could record from, these networks that you're showing here as regions of interest, and you could measure multiple sites in, let's say many sites in each of the major regions.
One thing we could redo all of this at a much faster time scale.
From fMRI.
Absolutely. So MRI, I mean, in a way, I feel like with this work, we're kind of reaching the limits of what we can do with MRI. I'm beginning to think, what next? Because, given the courses of the blur, the low pass filtering of the signal, and given the fact that these mental operations are likely playing out over, tens, hundreds of milliseconds, it's going to be very hard to push that notion of looking for the neural basis of volitional mental operations given MRI. But if we could do something similar with monkeys, we'd have an incredible increases in temporal resolution. And you could actually use these connectivity graphs to do multivariate pattern classification over, say, Granger causal graphs, and say, this region is causing that region on the order of, milliseconds. And you could really look at patterns of information flow when an animal is in, doing this mental operation versus that mental operation, or representing this shape versus that shape. So yeah, I think that, what the techniques that you have invented permit really an incredible increase in the level of analysis of whole brain circuits, and patterns of activation at that level. So it's really important and exciting, and I would love to, take part in anything like that.
Yeah, I have a question. Sorry.
Patrick.
Yes, I had a question, I guess, for both of you, for both the fMRI and multi-unit recordings. And that's, you mentioned many times how the temporal resolution of the fMRI was not really very well matched to the mental operations you were trying to get at. And I wonder if you could think of particular tasks, either for the high-speed multi-electrode or for the very slow-speed fMRI. Think of validation tasks. So let's say your TR, your temporal resolution is maybe 2 seconds, but the bold signal is maybe even slower than that. What is it you can think of as a mental operation? In your tasks, the mental operations are difficult, but it's really hard to say what any one subject is doing at any one time. And I can be, mulling about something and turning it over in my mind, but a different subject will be doing something completely different, and a different time in my task, I'll be doing something very difficult to know or control what's going on. But if you could construct a validation task where, in fact, I have to do something at a particular pace, maybe I have to count to 100, and then I do one thing, I have to count to 100, I do another thing. Anyway, so that you have real control of what the mental states are that you're reading out with the bold signal, and then analyzing with Granger causality or principal components or whatever else you want to do with them. If you had any way to actually be sure what's going on, rather than sort of doing it backwards, trying to figure out what's going on where, based on tasks which are hard to really control. So, so that's you would like to have two tasks like that. One, a very slow rate that you could use to validate all of these very high-level analysis tools to prove that they're actually doing something meaningful. And then you'd also like to have another task that's much higher speed, where multi-electrode recordings analyzed with PA and range of causality could also verify that the analysis techniques are doing what you actually now know is happening, sequence by sequence. Okay, so I'll give you 2 minutes. Can you come up with those two tasks?
I agree. I agree completely, Patrick. I mean, it would be great to be able to take control of people's mental operations, such that we can know.
You can do that. I mean, that's what we're trained to do. We're psychologists and physiologists. You can make up tasks that do exactly that. where you actually going to schedule their mental activities moment by moment and not let them deviate.
Yeah, I agree. And I hope we can move in that direction. I think that the notion of sequencing, which is Teresa's sequencing and operations, is very interesting. And, it'd be very nice to be able to give people chains of mental operations such that that chain of operations, the probability of getting it correct is very low, whether it's a shape judgment or some kind of other judgment. And then we would be able to take control of it by giving them the command, sequentially, what they would have to do. For monkey neurophysiology, we'd want to have something, obviously faster. And, monkeys are very good at certain mental operations. I mean, I'm pretty amazed at some of the operations that monkeys can do. Have you seen that Matsuzawa chimpanzee video?
Yeah, it's very humbling.
So the chimpanzee it's simply, what makes us able to conceive of airplanes is not our mental workspace capacity. It's not working memory capacity. Matsuzawa has these chimpanzees look at the sequence of numbers, 9 numbers, that, they obviously don't know what those numbers mean, but they can press them in sequence. The 9 numbers flash, boom, and then they're covered up with masks, and the chimpanzee goes, pop, 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 pop. And humans really are much worse at anything like that. And so chimpanzees, at least in that task, have a better or larger working memory capacity. So, it's not a capacity issue. It's really what we're doing in our mental workspace, the mental operations. Anyway, I would love to talk to you and Charlie and everybody else and Teresa and try to think about ways to create volitionally, attentionally loading sequences of mental operations that we can control very precisely and ideally look across the whole brain, not just with MRI, but with Charlie's methods. Yeah.
I'm reminded of Yantis would have these multiple RSVP streams that which one you're supposed to be attending to is contingent upon the targets that appear. And so there's this multiple timescales of the individual RSVP stream in the moment, and these sort of if-then sequential, and maybe there's some way of creating tasks that you have multiple time frames simultaneously.
Anyway, so when we all come here in June, it would be nice to really set some time apart to just brainstorm about future experiments and how to build on all of our separate work in a way that will benefit the whole thing. But it's already 3:06, and I usually try to stick to time. So unless there's any more burning questions, I think we should end it.
Thanks a lot, Peter.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks a lot, Peter.
All right. Have a good day.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.